Welcome back to Saruwatari Xtreme. Today was going to be a very exciting day, as yesterday I had time to move a lot of the vehicles out of the way and get the NSX out, and I haven't had time to drive it. And the NSX, as most of you know, is one of Drew's favorite cars. And seeing that she's been doing a lot of detail work for me, I owe her a dinner. So I figured this would be a great opportunity for me to repay my debt. Unfortunately, as we come back today, the AC has decided to sign off. Yesterday, everything was fine when I checked out the car, but now it is blazing hot in here, as I don't know if you can see the sweat coming off my forehead, but it is very uncomfortable. And Drew becomes very irritable when she gets hot and sweaty. Now, there are a few exceptions to those circumstances. This car would slowly bleed off. As it's a 91, it used R12, and I would have to recharge every now and then. But that would indicate that I had a small leak. What happened from yesterday to today is much larger, and the only time I've ever seen this is on my F355 and some of the farm vehicles when I've actually lost a compressor seal. So in this car right now, I can actually hear the compressor still cycling. So that's an indication that a lot of things are still operable. But obviously I definitely have something going wrong because it is very toasty in here. So we'll just have to take a look and see if we can figure out what's going on. What we want to try and do is first go ahead and hook up the R12 manifold. On the high pressure port is right here. The low pressure port is right back here on the left side of the brake master cylinder. Now on the high pressure side, even from Honda, they recommend using this snap-on adapter. You can get a good look at it right there. The hose is pretty self-explanatory. Red high, blue low, yellow is the feed. All right, I fired the NSX and just no good news here. So with the AC running, no pressure on either side, which would of course point us in the direction we have a very big leak somewhere. So hopefully that will make it easier to find. But to find the leak, we're definitely gonna have to put some Freon into the system. The NSX uses R12. A lot of times you can just buy these off eBay, wherever you want to get them. It's hard to source it locally usually. And they make tops that come on that can be reusable, but typically those always leak on me. So the best thing I use is the lock on the side that pierces a can. I seem to have the best luck with those. We want to hook it into the yellow hose, which is the feed. And you want to always keep it upright so the can feeds the gas into the system. Just put the can down there so it's level, and then just open the leads on the manifold. Okay, the Freon's there. Okay, I can hear the compressor engaged, I can hear the fans going. So we'll open the low side on the manifold to send in the Freon on the low side. As the low side fills, we should start to see pressure on the high side. The Freon sometimes goes slow into the system, so what you can do is you can take warm water and then take the Freon and put it into the warm water. That will accelerate the process greatly to 50. So that's bringing it up, so it'll enter the system much faster. The 12 ounces of Freon is now in the system. That should give us enough to see if we can track down the leak. We'll use the leak detector. A lot of you probably wonder if I'm gonna use dye, but you know, dye is kind of an arguable subject. I've had a lot of bad luck with dye, and everyone has their own opinion, but I just don't like to use dye because I've had a lot of problems with it knocking out compressors. And on farm equipment and stuff that I could send out, it's not really a big issue, but on these cars that I have to work on, it's definitely a problem. Okay, so we close off the valves, so we're not feeding anything in any direction. Take off the adapter. Once the manifold is clear, you can take the Freon detectant sensor, fire it up. It usually takes a few seconds to get warmed up, and then basically just visually take a look at the whole layout. I mean, if you have the service manual, it details everything. Now, I will say this specifically on the NSX. I really don't see anything up here, but the evaporator is inside the dash, and a lot of times it's a suspect for places to leak Freon. The difficult part is you have to pull the whole interior of the car apart, and there aren't a whole lot of people that will do it. Some of my friends at Honda have the skill set to do it, and they refuse to even do it for me, no matter how much money I'd pay them. So if that is what has gone out, then I would have to pull the whole car apart myself, interior-wise, and from what I've been told from people that have a much better skill set than me, it is quite miserable. So I want to double check every other avenue before going there. So the next thing we'll do is we'll put the car up in the air, the lines, the high and low are running from the back, and check the compressor. That usually is a source of problems for me. Okay, since we checked everything up front, the next thing we'd want to do is fire up our sensor and take a look. The AC compressor is located in front of the oil pan. I can't get you in there to really see anything. It's really tight, so I'll try and get a close-up here, but I usually start to check by looking at the front seal and the rear seal of the compressor. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like I'm picking anything up. So the next thing we probably want to do is follow the lines. Of course, it's way up on top. Low pressure, high pressure. Well, it definitely seems like we're picking something up there. Seems specific to the high pressure side. All right, you're good. Follow the high pressure line down. See if we pick anything up. There's some couplers here. Nothing there. I'll run the line all the way to the tunnel, but that is bad times because the only way to see what's really going on and assess the problem would be to actually pull the compressor down. So, as usual, I guess we will proceed onward. In preparation to pull the compressor, the first thing we want to do is disconnect the battery, and then we need to disconnect the compressor from the wiring harness. In front of the oil dipstick, there is a plug where the connector is. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is pull down the rear beam bar assembly. And the parking brake cables are locked in right here, so just hook it into air. I believe it's a 12mm socket to pull it down. Check it out and see. There's a stud with a nut and a big bolt up here. Looks like about a 17mm. As I loosen the last two bolts, I notice that there are also two parking brake cable mounts up front. So I'm going to pull those off. All right. Now we should be ready to remove the last two bolts. That's good. Let's give it a shot here. To get this front beam down to access the compressor, this bracket is going to have to come out, which also has the supports for the transmission shifting cables. We'll disconnect those. Let's pull down the cover so we can access the transmission cable. Okay, so the shifting cables are locked onto these with cotter pins, and you can just bend them back with a small needle nose and carefully work them back. Hopefully they'll come out. let's see if we can get that front beam down. There is one final thing holding in the front beam, and that's the front motor mount. The problem is I can't get a camera in there at all for you to see what I'm doing. It's a lot by feel, but I'll explain what's going on. So what they have is they have a cross bolt in the motor mount coming from the driver's side to the passenger side, but luckily in Honda fashion, the nut is insanely hard to get into. You could get in there with a 17mm stubby if you had to, but man, it's really tight. But luckily, the nut has a lock on the back side, so you can use a 17mm coming across from the driver's side. And what I used was a 1/2-inch impact with the snap-on wobble socket, and I was able to break it free. And then I backed it off with a 17mm 3/8 drive, so I could maneuver easily in there. Then once everything's free, you're okay, as long as there's no corrosion on that bolt. As most of the bolts in the NSX, that one also is aluminum coated. So as long as there's no corrosion, you don't drive it in the rain, you should be able to spin it off by hand. Let's see if we can get the front beam to come down. There's giving it a little bit. Again, the parking brake cables are a little bit in the way, so you just want to be careful not to pinch them. Okay, we're clear on that side. And there it is. With the front beam down, now we can get a nice view of the headers that Derek and Daryl made for me, and a good view of the compressor. If you look real carefully at the bottom of the compressor, you can see there's a little bit of oil. It's easier just to kind of go over this new compressor. So this is a connector, and we talked about doing it from the top side. I was having a rough time doing it, so I opened up the bottom just to see. It was a lot easier for me on the bottom. It just had the spring clip, and then lift the tab to pull it off the bracket. Good to go. As far as the top of the compressor, this isn't exactly what it looks like because this needs to be changed, but it at least gives us an idea so I can explain it. So the two lines come into the top of the compressor here, and there is a bolt on each line holding it. All I used was a 12mm open-end box gear wrench, and I was able to pull those and loosen those. Just to the left of the compressor, you can see the idler pulley. I used a 14mm open-end box to release the nut holding it in place. You can see the adjusting bolt for the idler pulley. So you send down a 12mm socket, and you can go ahead and relieve the tension. With the tension released, we can remove the AC belt. We also need to remove the hoses completely off the top of the compressor. Now I'll use a 12mm to loosen the compressor mounting bolts. Okay. With the compressor out of the way, we can get a good look at everything. Right there you can see the low side. The O-ring looks good, no problems there. But where the leak detector detected a problem, if we take a close look there at the high side, you can see right there where the O-ring is split. So it would definitely appear that cause and effect is the case. Okay, as you can see, we've got the new compressor. We have the old compressor. The first thing we want to do is pull the cap on the new compressor, touch the Schrader valve just to make sure there's no pressure inside the compressor. Everything is clear there, okay? Now, we are going to need to transfer the service valves from the old compressor to the new compressor. Now, the instruction manual for the new compressor says pour out the oil of the old compressor and then pour out the oil in the new compressor to confirm that they have the exact same amount in. So just spread some oil out on this plate, move the protective cover over to the old compressor, which will need to be serviced and rebuilt. That way I'll have a good spare. send this down real quick so we can get it out of the way. Okay, before we send up the compressor, we need to change the O-rings. So let's see if I can get in here. Now that the O-rings have been replaced on the lines and the compressor is all set to go, we can start putting it back together. I wrapped the hoses with a red rag to protect the O-rings, the fittings, and also the compressor itself. This bolt has to go in before we go up because it was such a tight fit getting it in and out. Next, torque the compressor mounting bolts down to 18 foot-pounds. Doing the compressor lines is almost completely blind, so the only thing I can tell you is that there is a torque spec. It's like 21.7 foot-pounds. When you're putting it in, wiggle the lines as much as possible to allow the O-ring to seat. Looks like now would be a good time to put the connector back on. Now we can put the belt back on. Okay, now from on top, we can tighten the adjusting bolt. There is a torque spec for the belt. It is 8.7 foot-pounds. Next, with the car back up in the air, we need to tighten the nut on the idler pulley to 32.5 foot-pounds is the spec. Okay, now that everything's clearance, we're ready to put the front beam up. If you want to make your life a lot easier, even though the nut has a tab to stop it, if you use some duct tape to hold the nut in place, it makes life a whole lot easier when putting the front motor mount bolt in. The front motor mount cross bolt's in. We want to torque it to 56 pounds. There it is. Okay, now I will put a light coat of grease on the shafts for the shift linkages. We can send these back up. Wipe them clean. I'll get 2 new cotter pins to put up and lock. We can put back the housing. Okay, now we're ready to put the front bracket on. Okay, now we'll wipe the surface in the rear beam assembly. We should be able to line it up on top carefully. I'm going to torque down the front beam since it also supports the front motor mount. There are 2 bolts and 1 nut per side that go down at 69 foot-pounds. Okay, now with the rear beam rod assembly back in, everything's closed up down below, looking pretty good. Hopefully everything goes well. I'm going to bring it back down, and the last step is I'm going to change those Schrader valves to try and eliminate one other possible place of a leak. Okay, after I finished that job of the compressor, I took the NSX to Malahi Ford. My good friends over there were nice enough to evacuate the system, put it under a vacuum for about 25 minutes to confirm that everything was okay in my work, and I was quite happy about that. They recharged the system with R12 and pretty much good to go. So, it looks like I can dig myself out of my hole and pay my debt to Drew for dinner. So since we are in your favorite car, would you like to drive?
No, I'd rather be chauffeur today.
Drew is the ultimate critic. So my dear, what do you think about the work and the temperature now?
A lot cooler, thank goodness. I was like sitting in a pool of sweat.
I don't know, that really doesn't sound that bad to me, in any case. Well, it is of course your choice. You were nice enough to detail all my cars. Where would you like to go to dinner?
You know, one of my girlfriends did mention something about a oyster bar.
I wasn't aware that you like oysters.
You might like it after I give it a try.
You know, it's funny you mention that because recently I do feel like I have gout coming on. This could be the cure that I need. Well, my friends, as exciting as that is, we must move on and go to dinner, and I must pay my debt to Drew. So, I hope that all of you have a great Thanksgiving with your families. See you next time.